April 1945. Over the Western Pacific, the last weeks of the war no longer sounded like thunder. They sounded like silence. High above the shipping lanes that once fed the Japanese Empire, American B-29 crews looked down on an ocean that seemed deceptively calm. No flames. No explosions. Only a quiet grid of coordinates, each one a point where a mine was about to fall, drift, arm itself, and wait. What the Japanese Navy feared most in those months was not a new bomber or a new battleship. It was the invisible pattern the United States was beginning to draw beneath the waves. A pattern precise enough to close a nation. Operation Starvation did not begin as a headline. It began as a technical reconsideration inside the U.S. Army Air Forces, a question whispered among planners who had grown skeptical of high-altitude bombardment. What if the most efficient way to break Japan's war machine was not through the sky, but through the sea? By early 1945, reconnaissance photographs confirmed a truth that no doctrine could ignore. Japan's industrial centers still stood, but its maritime lifelines were thin, fragile, and increasingly exposed. The logistics were straightforward in theory. Japan relied on coastal shipping to move coal, rice, ore, and fuel from its territories to its factories and cities. Destroy the flow, and production would break. Break production, and the war could end. Yet naval blockades demanded time, submarines, and risk. Airdropped mines, on the other hand, demanded precision, and a willingness to shift American air strategy away from spectacular raids toward a quieter, more methodical pressure. That shift began with the deployment of B-29s from the 313th Bomb Wing, operating from Tinian. Equipped with radar guidance and carrying specialized naval mines, magnetic, pressure, and acoustic variants, they approached Japanese waters at night, low and slow, far from the doctrine that had shaped their original design. These aircraft, built to reach 30,000 feet and deliver incendiaries over cities, were now flying barely above the waves, placing mines with the calm deliberation of engineers marking grid points on a blueprint. And so the hook of the story tightens. A massive strategic bomber turned into a surgical instrument, a nation dependent on maritime arteries, and an American operation so efficient that even its own commanders underestimated its long-term impact. Operation Starvation was not loud. It was not dramatic. But in the final months of the Pacific War, it became one of the most effective actions the United States executed, an operation that would choke Japan's logistics faster than any fleet or firebombing campaign could. By late spring of 1945, the conflict within American strategy was no longer about whether Japan could be defeated, but how, and at what cost. Inside the halls of the 20th Air Force, debates intensified. Many officers still favored large-scale incendiary raids, arguing that only overwhelming destructive force could break Japan's will. But the results were inconsistent. Entire districts burned, yes, but the Japanese war economy adapted, decentralizing workshops and dispersing production. Factories rebuilt. Transport lines shifted. The enemy refused to collapse. In contrast, the advocates of mine-laying presented a colder argument. Japan cannot rebuild what it cannot receive. If coal cannot reach steel mills, furnaces go dark. If food cannot move from the countryside to the cities, workers go hungry. If tankers cannot leave port, fleets cannot sail. The calculus was mathematical, and brutally simple. Still, resistance persisted. Mining operations were seen as unspectacular, lacking the explosive imagery that commanders had grown accustomed to when measuring success. But intelligence reports told a different story. Japanese shipping, once extensive, was shrinking to narrow coastal routes sheltered by islands and reefs. These channels, tight, predictable, unavoidable, were perfect for American mines. The conflict extended into the air as well. B-29 crews trained to fly at high altitude now faced a dangerous adjustment. Night operations at low level, over water, in hostile territory. Radar operators had to identify shorelines, river mouths, harbor entrances, features that appeared on screens as faint echoes, easily distorted by weather. Pilots described the missions as flying inside a black tunnel, where the walls were made of ocean. A single navigational error could send a bomber into the sea. And Japanese defenses adapted quickly. Patrol boats, anti-aircraft guns, and searchlights were stationed along critical approaches. The Imperial Navy deployed minesweepers, small, overstretched vessels that sailed under constant threat, racing to clear channels before sunrise. Yet for every mine neutralized, several more drifted silently into place. This created a new kind of pressure. Unlike traditional air raids, whose effects were immediate and visible, mine-laying created a slow tightening of Japan's maritime space. Ships stopped sailing at night. Convoys shrank. Insurance for merchant crews, already symbolic, ceased to matter. Every port admiral faced the same dilemma: either risk a vessel and lose it, or keep it docked and let the war economy suffocate. By June, the conflict within Japanese strategic thinking was unmistakable. Reports from the Ministry of Transport warned of catastrophic disruptions. Some cities received only a fraction of their usual supplies. Coal deliveries dropped so drastically that power output flickered across industrial regions. The sea, once the empire's strongest connective tissue, was turning into a barrier. What had begun as an internal American debate was becoming a decisive external crisis. The conflict phase of Operation Starvation was not defined by one battle, one raid, or one explosion. It was defined by the growing realization on both sides: the United States had found a way to strike Japan without needing to destroy Japan. And the empire was running out of time to respond. Through the summer of 1945, the United States pushed Operation Starvation to levels that few in the Japanese high command had anticipated. Each night, waves of B-29s left Tinian and Guam with their bomb bays filled not with incendiaries, but with carefully arranged racks of naval mines. The aircraft flew in disciplined intervals, spacing their drops so that the mines formed invisible barriers across strategic waterways. American planners referred to these patterns as curtains. Japanese sailors called them something simpler: walls. For port cities like Kobe, Osaka, Moji, and Shimonoseki, the situation deteriorated rapidly. Harbor masters who once coordinated hundreds of ship movements each month now worked with ledgers that showed almost nothing leaving and even less arriving. Coastal tankers, vital for moving oil, kerosene, and aviation fuel, remained tied to their moorings. Without fuel, transport trucks idled, factories slowed, and airfields struggled to maintain operational readiness. The internal Japanese reports that survived the war reveal a stark reality: the economy was fragmenting. Coal shipments along the vital Kyushu-Honshu route fell to a level that engineers described as structurally unsustainable. Larger cities recorded power cuts while steel mills began shutting down furnaces, not from bombardment damage, but simply from lack of material. Even the military felt the strain. Ammunition depots reported shortages not because production had stopped, but because transport had. American intelligence, reading intercepted communications, recognized that the strategy was working even faster than predicted. Analysts expected a gradual contraction. Instead, they observed something closer to freefall. And with each success, the United States expanded the scope of mine-laying missions, targeting river estuaries, ferry crossings, and inland waterways that supported regional distribution. These operations forced Japanese naval forces into increasingly desperate countermeasures. Minesweepers, most of them small, aging vessels, worked non-stop, exhausting crews who faced night after night of new minefields. But the problem was mathematical. American aircraft could drop mines exponentially faster than the Japanese could remove them. Every cleared channel was mined again within days. Some ports became so saturated that commanders abandoned them entirely. The psychological impact was profound. Merchant captains refused assignments. Insurance, rationing, and patriotic appeals no longer mattered when a single detonation could turn a steel hull into fragments. Even experienced naval officers admitted privately that they no longer understood which routes were safe, because none truly were. Meanwhile, the B-29 crews experienced their own form of tension. Flying low over dark water demanded constant vigilance. Turbulence at low altitude could snap a bomber into the waves. Radar returns distorted during storms, making coastlines appear closer or farther than they were. Yet mission after mission, the crews adapted, refining their timing, adjusting release altitudes, and coordinating their routes with meticulous precision. Each drop became a small but decisive act in a larger design. By July, the conflict phase of Operation Starvation reached its peak. Japan's maritime network had collapsed into a patchwork of isolated ports, each struggling to survive with whatever supplies remained on hand. It was no longer a question of whether the blockade would succeed. The question now was how long Japan could endure without its ocean lifelines, and what the United States would do next. By early August 1945, the blockade imposed by Operation Starvation was no longer a strategic pressure point. It had become a national crisis for Japan. What had started as a measured American experiment in aerial mine-laying matured into one of the most efficient logistical shutdowns in modern warfare. The data collected by naval intelligence confirmed what Japanese ministries already feared: the empire had effectively been sealed from the sea. American analysts tracked shipping losses with a methodical calm. Over 670 Japanese vessels, ranging from small coastal transports to large freighters, had been sunk or crippled by mines since the operation began. Even more significant was the number of ships that never left port. The presence of mines, regardless of whether they detonated, created a deterrent powerful enough to halt maritime traffic almost entirely. Ports that once saw hundreds of movements per week now recorded only a handful. Some recorded none at all. The United States had, in effect, turned geography into a partner. Japan's reliance on narrow straits, especially the Shimonoseki Strait, offered choke points ideal for concentrated mining. The more the Japanese tried to sweep these areas, the more predictable their movements became. American planners adapted accordingly, shifting mine patterns and staggering drop intervals to keep clearance crews off balance. Each adjustment created new uncertainty for Japanese shipping authorities, who struggled to understand where it was safe to sail. The economic effects deepened. Coal shipments along the inland sea fell by nearly 90%. Industrial output, already weakened by air raids, now faced its most crippling shortage: the inability to move raw materials. Many factories operated at a fraction of their capacity. Others shut down altogether. Power generation, dependent on steady coal deliveries, sagged under the strain. Cities faced rolling blackouts. Rail networks slowed. Even basic goods, rice, salt, cooking oil, became difficult to distribute. For the Japanese Navy, the situation bordered on unsustainable. Fuel, which had been rationed for years, reached critically low levels. Training flights were cancelled. Naval patrols shrank. Ship crews remained docked, knowing that leaving port meant risking both the ship and the fuel it carried, fuel that could not be replaced. Some officers noted that the fleet no longer required enemy firepower to stay in harbor. The mines alone ensured that outcome. Inside American command centers, the results of Operation Starvation produced a quiet but visible shift. Senior officers, once skeptical of devoting B-29s to mine-laying, now acknowledged the operation's strategic weight. Reports from the Joint Chiefs highlighted the unprecedented ratio of effort to effect: minimal aircraft losses, modest ordnance expenditure, and near-total disruption of maritime logistics. The United States had discovered a method of warfare that leveraged precision and persistence rather than spectacle. Yet despite its overwhelming success, Operation Starvation remained overshadowed by larger events unfolding at the same time. The incendiary raids continued. The atomic bombings approached. And the broader narrative of the war moved toward its final chapters. But within the analytical circles of the U.S. military, the significance of the blockade was unmistakable. Japan had been isolated, not by siege lines or grand battles, but by a system of quiet mechanical devices drifting beneath the waves. For the first time since the operation began, American strategists could measure the result in weeks, not months. The blockade had reached its full effect. The empire's supply arteries were no longer constricted, they were severed. As the summer progressed, the cumulative impact of Operation Starvation became impossible for Japan to offset. What made the operation uniquely effective was not just the physical destruction of vessels, it was the systemic uncertainty it created. Every harbormaster, every naval officer, every merchant captain now operated under the same haunting question: where is the next mine? The Japanese Navy's attempts at organization became a cycle of reaction rather than strategy. constantly adjusting to mine patterns that the United States shifted with each mission. American crews, meanwhile, developed a rhythm that turned the operation into a nightly routine of quiet precision. Radar operators tracked coastal outlines with a practiced eye, interpreting faint reflections as harbors or river mouths. Pilots executed low-altitude passes with steady hands, dropping mines in carefully timed sequences. Bombardiers described the missions as drawing lines across water, lines no one could see, but everyone would feel. Even the engineers on Tinian and Guam refined the arming mechanisms and delayed fuses to match specific tidal conditions around Japanese ports. By mid-August, American intelligence officers estimated that Japan had lost over 80% of its operational shipping capacity. The remaining vessels were concentrated in a few inland waterways, forming a bottleneck of ships too valuable, or too vulnerable, to risk at sea. Coal shipments, once measured in millions of tons per month, now barely reached a fraction of that. Urban centers reported food shortages severe enough to disrupt normal administrative functions. Industrial districts that had survived firebombing now suffered from stillness. Machines without raw materials, factories without output, and workers without work. The blockade did not just strangle the war effort, it reshaped Japanese daily life. Public transit faltered, ration queues lengthened, and officials warned that major cities could face humanitarian crises if supply chains did not resume. But there were no ships left to restart them. And even if there had been, there were no routes free of mines. On the American side, strategic analysis grew increasingly confident. Reports drafted for the Joint Chiefs of Staff noted that Operation Starvation had become one of the most cost-effective campaigns conducted in the Pacific. Aircraft losses were remarkably low. Mine production was efficient. And, critically, the blockade achieved effects that traditional bombardment could not. It denied mobility itself. Japan was no longer simply damaged, it was immobilized. In the final days of the war, as diplomatic messages crossed the Pacific and Japan approached surrender, the U.S. Navy conducted post-strike assessments. Reconnaissance flights photographed silent harbors filled with anchored ships, many of them rusting from months of inactivity. Engineers examined mine-sweeping data and noted that the majority of attempted clearances failed to restore usable channels. The blockade held until the end. Yet despite its strategic weight, Operation Starvation remained largely overshadowed by the dramatic events of August 1945. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki shaped public memory, while the blockade, precise, mechanical, and incremental, became a quieter chapter, understood mainly by planners and analysts. But in those final weeks, Japan's isolation was absolute. The United States had crafted a weapon that required no fire and no shock to achieve its effect. It demanded only patience, calculation, and control of the air. And through that control, the empire's maritime heartbeat fell silent. In the weeks following Japan's surrender, American analysts finally had the opportunity to examine the full results of Operation Starvation. What they discovered reshaped their understanding of air power and maritime warfare. For the first time, the United States could quantify the strategic effect of a campaign designed not to destroy enemy industry directly, but to disconnect it, silently, methodically, and without the spectacle typically associated with air operations. Survey teams entered Japanese ports that had been sealed for months. They found cargo vessels coated in dust, their engines cold, their cargo holds empty. Fishing fleets that once supported coastal communities sat idle, many half-submerged after months without maintenance. Naval bases that once projected power across the Pacific were reduced to static collections of ships that had not left harbor since spring. The sea, which had sustained the empire for generations, now surrounded it as a barrier rather than a bridge. When American officers interviewed Japanese officials, a consistent narrative emerged. The blockade had reached a point where continued resistance was not just difficult, but mathematically impossible. Even before the atomic bombings, and even before the Soviet entry into the war, Japan's internal communications acknowledged that maritime supply lines were collapsing faster than emergency measures could replace them. Production was falling in every sector, not because factories were destroyed, but because they had become isolated islands in a disconnected economy. The most striking insight came from the ministry responsible for transport and logistics. Their records showed that by July 1945, The majority of cargo movements inside the empire had slowed to a fraction of pre-war levels. Some cities received less than 10% of required food and coal shipments. For a nation that relied heavily on coastal shipping, this represented a structural breakdown. There was no workaround. Rail systems could not absorb the burden, fuel shortages restricted truck transport, and the remaining ships were either damaged, trapped, or unwilling to sail. For the United States, Operation Starvation demonstrated a principle that would influence post-war strategy. Control of the sea does not always require fleets. It can be achieved from the air, through persistent pressure and intelligent targeting. The mines dropped by B-29s, small, silent, and unremarkable in appearance, had proven capable of producing effects traditionally associated with naval blockades, but at a fraction of the cost and risk. And yet, despite its unprecedented success, the operation remained an understated chapter in the narrative of the Pacific War. Historians often focused on the dramatic final acts, the massive firebombing campaign, the atomic attacks, the naval battles that defined earlier years. But within the internal assessments of the U.S. Army Air Forces and the Navy, Operation Starvation was regarded with a kind of quiet admiration. It had achieved precisely what it set out to do, with an efficiency that surprised even its architects. As American forces demobilized and reconstruction plans began, the significance of what had happened beneath the waves became clear. The United States had applied air power in a fundamentally new way, not to overwhelm, but to constrict, not to shock, but to suffocate the material foundations of war. And in doing so, it had rewritten the boundaries of strategic influence over the sea. As post-war evaluations continued, the United States undertook a detailed study of the minefields laid during Operation Starvation. Navy divers, engineers, and ordnance specialists recovered surviving mines and analyzed their performance. What they found confirmed the extraordinary reliability of the weapons. Many mines had armed correctly despite rough seas, strong currents, and months of exposure. Their magnetic and acoustic triggers remained stable, their anchor lines intact, their casings resistant to corrosion. To planners, this level of durability validated the entire premise of the campaign. A single mine could influence a shipping route for weeks, sometimes months, without further intervention. Japanese mine-clearing crews, interviewed after the war, described an experience marked by exhaustion and constant uncertainty. Each mission was a race against an enemy they could neither see nor predict. Some crews spent entire nights sweeping channels that would be remined before morning. Others attempted to open alternate routes, only to find new mines waiting in areas previously considered safe. On several occasions, cleared lanes were closed again within 24 hours. The Japanese recognized the pattern, but they lacked the resources to respond. Their fleet was too damaged, their fuel too scarce, and their manpower too limited to maintain a defense against a threat that renewed itself every night. American analysts also examined the decision-making behind the operation. The campaign's success, they concluded, stemmed not from technological superiority alone, but from a shift in operational thinking. Traditional naval doctrine emphasized decisive battles and direct confrontation. Operation Starvation inverted that logic. Instead of seeking a clash with the Japanese fleet, the United States targeted the infrastructure that allowed the fleet, and the nation, to function. It was an indirect approach, but one backed by precise intelligence, modern air power, and the ability to sustain continuous pressure. This shift reflected a broader evolution in American strategy during the Pacific War. As the conflict progressed, the United States increasingly embraced methods that leveraged its industrial capacity and technological adaptability. Mining operations showcased both strengths: rapid production of ordnance and the use of aircraft in roles far beyond their original design. The B-29, conceived as a high-altitude strategic bomber, had demonstrated its versatility by becoming a platform for one of the most effective naval blockades in history. In the years that followed, military academies studied Operation Starvation as a textbook example of economy of force. It provided a clear demonstration of how carefully targeted pressure could produce strategic outcomes disproportionate to the resources invested. The operation also influenced early Cold War planning, underscoring the idea that control over critical supply lines, whether maritime, airborne, or even electronic, could shape the outcome of future conflicts without the need for massive, destructive campaigns. Yet for all its analytical significance, there was a quiet human dimension as well. B-29 crews who flew the night missions often reflected on how different these operations felt compared to traditional bombing runs. There was no firestorm below, no towering columns of smoke rising to meet them. Instead, there was only darkness, a coastline traced by faint radar echoes, and the knowledge that each mine released into the water would have an effect long after the aircraft returned to base. It was a form of warfare defined by patience and precision. By the time these evaluations concluded, one truth had become clear within American strategic circles. Operation Starvation had not merely assisted in Japan's defeat, it had accelerated it. And it had done so through a method of warfare that proved the power of silent disruption over visible destruction. In the final accounting of the Pacific War, Operation Starvation stands as one of the most efficient campaigns the United States ever executed, yet also one of the quietest. There were no iconic photographs, no dramatic footage of battleships in flames, no sweeping images of cities devastated from above. Instead, the operation left behind a subtler imprint, abandoned harbors, silent docks, and shipping lanes that had become invisible minefields. Its legacy lived not in spectacle, but in results. For American planners, the success of the operation offered a lesson that resonated far beyond 1945. Strategic control does not always require overwhelming force. Sometimes it requires identifying the single element a nation cannot function without, and isolating it. In Japan's case, that element was maritime transport. Without it, the empire's geography, supply chains, and industrial network unraveled. The United States, leveraging air superiority and precise intelligence, had applied pressure exactly where it mattered most. As historians revisited the campaign, many were struck by the contrast between the operation's modest scale and its immense impact. The mines dropped by B-29s were small by the standards of modern ordnance. They made no sound as they drifted beneath the surface. Yet each one represented a decision point for the enemy, a route avoided, a ship delayed, a resource that never reached its destination. Multiply that decision thousands of times across the empire, and the cumulative effect became impossible to overcome. The operation also illustrated the adaptability of American forces in the late war. The B-29 Superfortress, a symbol of high-altitude strategic bombing, proved capable of executing low-level maritime interdiction missions with remarkable accuracy. Aircrews who had trained to strike industrial centers found themselves navigating coastlines by radar, calculating tidal movements, and releasing mines in patterns more reminiscent of engineering surveys than traditional bombing runs. Their work required discipline and calm, and it shaped a campaign whose effectiveness outlasted each individual flight. In Japan, the consequences were felt in every corner of the economy. Factories stalled not because they were destroyed, but because raw materials never arrived. Coal shortages forced power cuts that rippled through entire regions. Cities struggled to maintain basic services. Naval operations shrank to defensive gestures. The empire's vast geography, once a strategic advantage, became a liability when its maritime arteries closed. When Japan surrendered in mid-August 1945, several factors influenced its decision. The atomic bombings, the Soviet entry into the war, and the cumulative exhaustion of years of conflict. But beneath these major shocks was a quieter truth. Japan had already lost the ability to sustain itself. The blockade created by American mines had removed the foundation on which every other aspect of the war depended. After the war, as ports reopened and mines were cleared, Japanese officials acknowledged the scale of the disruption. Many expressed surprise at how thoroughly the operation had isolated the country, and how quickly its effects had multiplied. American strategists, reviewing the data, recognized that Operation Starvation represented an evolution in modern warfare. It demonstrated that targeted pressure on a nation's logistical core could yield strategic outcomes as decisive as any battle. And so the story of Operation Starvation ends not with a dramatic climax, but with a quiet conclusion. An empire cut off by forces it could not see, and a United States that used precision and patience to reshape the course of the Pacific War. It remains a reminder that the most powerful operations are sometimes the ones that leave the least visible traces, and that control of the sea can be achieved from the air, not with a single decisive strike, but with thousands of silent decisions sinking slowly beneath the waves.